cake was sitting right there on the counter. 3 tiers, cream cheese frosting, decorated with little edible flowers I'd spent 2 hours picking out at the specialty shop downtown. And my mother-in-law looked at it, looked at me, and said, "Did you at least make it yourself, or just buy it?" My husband laughed. Not a nervous laugh, a real one. I stood there holding a serving knife and I smiled, because that's what I do. I smiled and said, "I made it." And she said, and walked away to refill her wine glass, and the moment was just gone, swallowed up by the noise of the party like it had never happened. That was 18 months ago. I should have paid more attention to that. Let me back up. My name is Audrey. I'm 32 years old. I'm a licensed occupational therapist. I work 4 days a week at a pediatric clinic in Charlotte, and for the last 3 years, I have been married to a man named Ross, who is genuinely one of the kindest people I've ever met. When it's just the two of us, around his family, he becomes someone I don't entirely recognize, softer in the wrong ways, quieter when he should speak. Ross's family isn't large. There's his mother, Constance, who retired early from a school district administrator position, and now treats every family gathering like a board meeting she's already decided the outcome of. His older sister, Maureen, who has 2 kids and a husband named Phil who works in insurance and says things like, "well, technically," before sentences that don't require the word technically. And then there's Ross's dad, Frank, who mostly watches football and agrees with whatever Constance says, which I think is less about conviction and more about 38 years of finding it easier. I liked them, at first. I really did. Constance is sharp and funny when she wants to be. Maureen and I bonded over reality television during my first Thanksgiving with them. Phil is harmless if you don't let him corner you near the appetizers. The problem crept in slowly, the way those things always do. It started with comments about the apartment Ross and I shared before we bought our house. Constance came to visit once and mentioned, twice, that the neighborhood felt transitional. I didn't know what that meant at the time. I figured it out later when she told Ross, not me, that she hoped we'd move somewhere more established before we had children. Then there were the comments about my job. Occupational therapy is a good career. It pays well, the work is meaningful, and I'm good at it. But it was never quite the right kind of impressive for Constance. She'd introduce me at things by saying Audrey works with children in a tone that made it sound like I supervised a daycare. Ross's college girlfriend had been a corporate attorney. I know this because Constance mentioned it 4 times in the first year I knew her. Always in passing. Always in a context where it somehow made sense to bring up. I let it go. Ross said his mom was just like that. I meant she meant well, and I believed him because I wanted to, and because the alternative, that she didn't mean well, was a harder thing to sit with. We bought a house 2 years into our marriage. A 3-bedroom craftsman in a neighborhood I love, with a porch and a yard that backs up to a greenway. We did it ourselves. Our savings, our down payment, our mortgage in both our names. It felt enormous and real and ours. Constance came to see it and said the kitchen was cozy. The kitchen is 400 square feet. It is not cozy, but okay. What I didn't know when we bought the house was that Ross had quietly promised his mother something. Not a legal thing, not a written thing. Just a promise. The kind that lives in the space between family members who've never had to make anything official because they've always trusted each other. He told her that if she ever wanted to come stay for an extended period, after Frank's 2nd knee surgery, after they sold the house in Greensboro and downsized, she could stay with us, in our house, in the guest room. He told me about this 3 weeks after we closed. "It won't be a big deal," he said. "It'll be a few weeks, maybe a month. She just needs somewhere to land while they figure out the condo situation." I want to say I pushed back hard. I didn't. I said, "Okay, but we need to talk about expectations." And Ross said, "Absolutely." And then we didn't talk about expectations. And 6 months later, Constance arrived with 7 pieces of luggage and a label maker. She labeled things in my kitchen. My spatulas. The shelf where I keep the cutting boards. She put a little label on the canister of coffee that said, "Constance, do not use," which I found on a Tuesday morning before work when I was half asleep and needed coffee. I used the coffee anyway. It felt like an act of revolution. Here's the thing about living with someone who is subtly unkind. You spend a lot of time wondering if you're imagining it. Constance never yelled. She never said anything overtly cruel. She was the queen of the comment that could always be walked back, "I just meant," or "You're so sensitive," or the very effective "I was only joking, Audrey." She told my friend Becca at a dinner we hosted that I had really come into my own since marrying Ross, Becca told me later because she thought I'd want to know. I did, and I didn't. She rearranged the living room while Ross and I were at work one Wednesday. Just moved things. Said the flow was better. Ross came home and said he kind of liked it actually, and I stood in my own living room feeling like a guest. But the moment, the real moment, the one I keep coming back to, was Easter. We hosted Easter that year. Maureen and Phil and the kids came down from Raleigh. Frank drove up from the retirement community where he'd moved after the second knee surgery, and I cooked for 2 days. I made a glazed ham, a green bean casserole, homemade rolls, roasted asparagus, a lemon tart. I set the table with the good dishes. I bought flowers. We sat down, and before anyone had even passed anything, Frank looked across the table at me and said, "So are you still working part-time?" I work 4 days a week. I've mentioned this multiple times. But I said, I work 4 days a week, yeah. And he said, Ross said you might go back to full-time once Constance is around to help with the house. I looked at Ross. Ross looked at his plate. I said, I'm sorry? And Constance said smoothly, well, it would make sense, wouldn't it? Now that you have support, you could take on more at the clinic. The table was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then Phil said, this ham looks incredible. And Maureen asked the kids to please sit down, and the moment dissolved, and no one said anything. And I smiled, and I passed the rolls, and I sat with it. I sat with it through dinner, and through dessert, and through the dishes, and through the kids watching a movie in the living room, and through Frank falling asleep in my armchair, and through Constance telling me that the lemon tart was a little sweet, but not bad. I sat with it until after everyone left, and Ross and I were alone in the kitchen at 9:30 at night, and I finally said, what did you tell your mother about my job? The conversation that followed was not our finest. Ross said he'd just been talking through options. I said those options were mine to talk through, not his. He said I was making it into something bigger than it was. I said I didn't think I was. He said his mom was just trying to be helpful, trying to contribute to the household, and I said she'd contributed by labeling my coffee and rearranging my furniture and apparently discussing my career with my husband without me present. He went quiet. Then he said, I know she's a lot, but she's my mom, and she needed somewhere to go, and I thought, I know what you thought, I said. I just needed you to think about me first. We went to bed, not fighting exactly, but not okay either. She stayed for 4 months. 4 months of labels and rearranged furniture and comments about the way I loaded the dishwasher, and a period of 2 weeks where she decided to cook dinner every night, because she was trying to help. And the meals were fine, but my kitchen smelled like her casseroles, and she'd given away my parking spot in the driveway because it was closer to the house and she needed it more. The thing that finally broke me wasn't a big moment. It was small. It's always small. I came home from work on a Thursday. A long day. A hard one. The kind where you're managing a 6-year-old in sensory crisis and trying to keep yourself regulated enough to keep them regulated. And I walked in the door and I needed 10 minutes. Just 10 quiet minutes in my own house. Constance was on the phone in the living room, loudly. She held up a finger when I walked in, like I was the one interrupting. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed, and I thought very clearly, for the first time, I need this to end. I called my friend Deb that night after Ross fell asleep. I went out to the backyard and sat on the porch steps and talked to her for an hour. Deb is practical in the way that people who've been through hard things become practical. She didn't tell me I was wrong, and she didn't tell me to blow everything up. She just said, what do you actually want? I thought about it. I want my house back. Okay, she said. So what does that look like? That conversation was the beginning. I didn't do anything dramatic. I didn't blow up. I did something harder and slower and more deliberate. I started having direct conversations with Ross, not around things, but through them. I made him sit with the specifics. The label maker. The driveway. The Easter table, the career conversation I hadn't been invited into. Ross is a good man who had spent 35 years avoiding direct conflict with his mother. Watching him actually reckon with it was uncomfortable for both of us. There were nights where he'd get defensive, and nights where he'd get quiet in the way that meant he was actually processing. And I learned to tell the difference. He talked to Constance. I don't know exactly what was said because I wasn't there, and I think that was right. It needed to be him. But I know it wasn't easy because he came home looking like he'd run a long race. She cried, he said. I know, I said. She said she didn't realize. I wanted to say a lot of things to that. I said, okay. She moved out 6 weeks later. Not angrily, not with a scene. into a condo near Maureen in Raleigh that she'd been looking at for a while. The timing just became more definite. The day she left, I helped her carry boxes to Maureen's minivan. I hugged her. It wasn't fake, exactly. It was complicated in the way that all long relationships are complicated when you get to the end of a hard chapter. When the minivan pulled away, I stood in my driveway for a minute. Then I went inside and I took every single label off every single thing in my kitchen. I put them in a little pile and I threw them away. Then I made myself a cup of coffee from the canister, and I stood at my kitchen counter in the quiet of my own house, and I didn't have to perform anything for anyone. That was 3 months ago. Ross and I are in couples therapy now, which was my condition, and which he agreed to without negotiating, which told me something important. Our therapist is calm and direct and doesn't let either of us get away with the comfortable version of things. We're doing the work. It's not fast or easy, but it's real. Constance and I talk on the phone occasionally. She's never directly acknowledged the way things were, but she's also never been unkind since she left. I don't know if she changed or if she's just more careful. Maybe both. I've stopped needing to understand it entirely. What I've been thinking about lately, though, is Easter, not the thing Frank said. That was just Frank, running on old assumptions. I've been thinking about the moment after, when the table went quiet and I smiled and passed the rolls. How practiced that was. How automatic. I'd been performing fine for so long I'd forgotten I didn't have to. My house is different now, not just because Constance isn't in it. Because I'm different in it. I take up my space differently. I leave things in the places I want them. I load the dishwasher however I want, and I don't feel a small pinch of self-consciousness about it. Last weekend, Ross and I had people over for the first time since everything settled. I made dinner, nothing elaborate, just good food on a normal Saturday. At one point, I looked around my table at people I'd actually chosen, laughing at something, easy and loud, and I felt it. This is mine. Not ours in some negotiated, contested way. Mine. And Ross's. Ours the way it was supposed to be. I don't know if I handled everything perfectly. I know I waited longer than I should have to say the things that needed saying. I know there were moments where I chose the smooth surface over the honest one, and I paid for that in small erosions. But here's what I also know. I didn't blow up my marriage. I didn't exile my mother-in-law. I didn't make anyone the villain of a story where everything's more complicated than that. I just said, eventually, clearly, without apology, this is my home. I live here. And that matters. It took me longer than it should have to believe I was allowed to say that out loud. I won't wait that long again. I think about the label maker a lot, not with anger anymore, more like clarity. Because that little plastic device sitting on my kitchen counter, systematically marking things that weren't hers to mark, was actually telling me something true the whole time. It was telling me who she believed had the right to occupy space in that house. And for a long time, without fully realizing it, I agreed with her. That's the part that took me the longest to reckon with, not what Constance did. What I allowed, every time I smiled through a comment that stung, every time I said it's fine to Ross when it wasn't, every time I rearranged my own sense of what was reasonable so the surface could stay smooth. I was making a choice. Small choices, but they compounded. They always do. That's how you end up standing in your own living room feeling like a guest. What I had to grow into, and I mean actually grow, because it didn't come naturally, was the understanding that being a decent person doesn't mean absorbing everything. I spent a long time confusing those two things. I thought that if I was kind enough, patient enough, understanding enough, it would eventually be recognized and reciprocated. It wasn't a strategy exactly. It was more like a belief I'd inherited without examining it. Goodness, as a kind of waiting game. But goodness without honesty isn't really goodness. It's just conflict avoidance wearing a better outfit. The truly ethical thing, the thing that actually serves everyone, including Constance, was to say clearly what was true. This is my house. These are my boundaries. This is what I need. I should have said it sooner. I know that now. The harder piece was figuring out what I actually thought underneath all the accommodating. That took real work. It meant sitting with discomfort instead of smoothing it over, noticing when I was rationalizing instead of reasoning, asking myself honest questions about what I wanted versus what I thought I was supposed to want. Ross and I do that in therapy now. We call it going to the real thing. And it's harder than it sounds when you've spent years getting very good at staying on the surface. And then there's the part where you have to actually act. Knowing something and doing something about it are two entirely different muscles. I knew for months before I said anything. The knowing wasn't enough. What finally moved me was deciding that my own comfort and dignity in my own home were worth the discomfort of a hard conversation. That sounds obvious written out. It took me an embarrassingly long time to actually believe it. Ross chose to do the hard thing too. He talked to his mother when it would have been so much easier not to. That mattered. That's still mattering. I don't think of what happened as a victory over Constance. She's a complicated person who needed somewhere to land and who didn't handle it well. And I made peace with that being a whole story rather than a simpler one. What I think of as a victory is smaller and more personal. I learned to trust that saying what's true is an act of respect. For myself, for Ross, and honestly, even for her. The label maker is gone. My coffee is just my coffee. My kitchen smells like what I cook in it. That's enough.